It was a long time ago. Earth was very different than nowadays. Internet was barely a concept, people actually spoke to each other face to face, and people were not really that much into dinosaurs as they are nowadays. It sounds quite surprising, actually. Dinosaurs have, however, been known for over a century by now, and were very popular. But there was a point in time where something called the dinosaur renaissance started to become a thing. This movement led to a full rework to how we saw dinosaurs. Instead of lumbering giant fat lizards, they were actually active, warm-blooded beasts not so far from mammals of nowadays. Although it's believed the Renaissance started as early as the 1960s, the transition to the general public's acknowledgement took its time. And while many parents from the 1960s to today are probably tired of hearing their 8-year-old kid whining because they want their freaking plastic Deinonychus toy, the likes of the general audience were conquered by one fundamental piece of media: Jurassic Park. And with this I am not mentioning the Crichton novels, but the movies themselves. Because, let's be honest, usually films capture the audience more than books, in the times that we live in. If you're a dinosaur nerd just like I unhealthily am, Jurassic Park is recognizable for showing several inaccuracies. If you're the kind of nerd that spends at least 2 hours every week ruminating over whether or not dinosaurs having lips or not is worth discussing, you will understand that Jurassic Park, at the time of its release, is actually damn accurate. Of course, this was 1993, and many years have passed, and we have a greater understanding of how dinosaurs actually were. So before people found out Velociraptor was just a meat-eating turkey, it was kind of okay to imagine it as a big bipedal lizard. Honestly, Jurassic Park lays the ground for people to accept dinosaurs as what they actually were, instead of being animals that were stupid and lumbering. I do tend to grab a movie and review it properly, in regards to several production and narrative aspects, but in this case I decided that it would make more sense to evaluate the Jurassic Park movies in regards to its scientific accuracy, and how 30 years of research have changed the way we look at these animals. So, let's get started. Hey, Gary, can you join us? Gary?
Hey, sorry, but I thought you knew I was kind of stuck here.
Yeah, I was kinda used with your company here as a cartoon character.
I am a cartoon character.
Oh, okay, so you can't join me here.
Yeah, that's kind of what's implied.
Okay, then let me continue.
Okay, but are you
Okay,
at least
maybe
gonna...
you should just go to sleep. Don't worry, it's fine. Anyway, getting back on topic, I do have one critique in regards to Jurassic Park as a franchise. It's obviously a money machine. As much as I adore the first movie, and as much as the sequels preserve the models of the dinosaurs that we love to attract a bigger audience, it gets to a point where the old models are getting overused. Even in 2015, when Jurassic World came out, a semi-reboot of the franchise, it already felt quite weird for them to stick with the old designs, which no longer respected an accurate rendition of the animals. In some cases it was even less accurate. So, in what ways could this be mitigated? And how would a Jurassic Park movie work if it was much more grounded in reality? Well, to be honest, a Jurassic Park movie grounded in reality wouldn't even have dinosaurs because it's impossible to bring them back. In the movies, it's most notably explained that paleontologists extracted DNA from amber, which contained mosquitoes, with dinosaur blood. It looks like a big brain moment, but it already has a lot of initial problems. Firstly, mosquitoes didn't exactly live throughout most of the Mesozoic. Not only they haven't been found anywhere earlier than the late Cretaceous, but molecular clock analysis also confirmed they hardly originated earlier than the Cretaceous period, and we know the Mesozoic era still had the earlier Triassic and Jurassic periods to encompass. However, we do know blood-sucking insects existed much earlier. Potential flea relatives are known from as far as the Jurassic, for example. This is far from being the only problem. Amber might not even be the best way to find exceptionally well-preserved prehistoric tissue. Surprisingly, we have found Hadrosaur and Tyrannosaur tissue so well preserved that it contained cartilage, collagen, and even cells in their nuclei with proteins as well, preserved in the very bones. I mean, makes all the sense given I doubt you could extract blood from a sea-living mosasaur out of a mosquito. Although findings of such ancient dinosaur DNA is questionable, this does show that exceptional preservation of cellular and molecular details such as these are possible. However, whatever DNA we find that is old is probably way too fragmentary to give us a full sequence of DNA. The Jurassic Park movie somewhat acknowledges this, but it's unlikely that it would be a significant percentage of DNA, enough to bring back an extinct animal. I would be surprised that even 0.1% of a full known avian dinosaur genome is recovered. To reconstruct the genome of an extinct animal accurately, it's nigh impossible to do it with such scant remains. The movie explains that, to gap these holes, the scientists filled it with frog DNA. Beyond narrative reasons, later explained to allow the dinosaurs to reproduce on their own, despite the population being only composed of females, the inclusion of frog DNA makes little sense. Presuming the DNA remains available are so sparse, you're pretty much giving a frog a few dinosaur genes rather than the other way around. But to reconstruct an extinct genome, it makes little sense to fill the gaps with animals that are wholly unrelated to them, or it would create problems with compatibility. For this, it would make more sense to fill the gaps with bird DNA, as birds are the only dinosaurs yet alive. And even still, it's a stretch, given the cloned dinosaurs in the franchise are, at the very least, over 160 million years apart evolutionarily from birds. And although hybrids have been recorded from animals that are nearly as distant for highly mutable clades like dinosaurs, it would probably not be ideal. Kinda hard to imagine a Triceratops chicken hybrid working the slightest. Okay, but let's assume, hypothetically, that you can indeed bring back the dinosaurs back to life in a way that are loyal to how they actually were. What would Jurassic Park look like on screen if that was the case? Would it really make sense for several of the iconic scenes of the franchise to be seen there? It's worth noting that the Jurassic Park movies are first and foremost movies. They are there to create spectacle. For example, take a look at the Tyrannosaurus Rex in the movies. Despite people being very aware of several intricacies of the T-Rex design due to exceptionally complete fossils, there are some liberties that were taken for the design of the Rex in the movie to make it appealing as a movie monster. Its face, for instance, as iconic as it is, it's slightly off from the actual animal. For example, the face is a bit longer, and the teeth perhaps were not as strongly exposed when the mouth closed, if we assume the presence of fleshy lizard-like lips. The velociraptor is also not that big in real life, or presents that exact physique. The name velociraptor was given to this animal because it sounded cool. The raptors we see are more probably based and inspired in Deinonychus, which was larger and had a much stockier skull. So it's clear that the movies put scientific accuracy in second place. And that's fine for a movie perspective. But for a movie that inspired a following generation to get even more interested in dinosaurs and studying them, it could surely have looked interesting if it placed accuracy first, rather than, in second. But I guess that would be entering a debate on whether or not a movie holds quality because it's scientifically accurate or because it's narratively effective and engaging. Well, let's start then. What mistakes do the dinosaurs have in the movie? I guess the first and easiest to start off with is the first dinosaur that we see in its full picture in the entire franchise, which is the mighty and beloved Brachiosaurus. Most of the basic features of the Brachiosaurus were nailed correctly. It was a very tall, magnificent animal that could reach to the top of some of the tallest trees in its environment. But since then we have known that some features of it are indeed wrong. For example, the unique and iconic pose of the Brachiosaurus standing on two legs to get to the top of the trees would probably be impossible to achieve. Brachiosaurus is named the armed lizard because it had four limbs larger than the hind limbs. This makes it rather front-heavy, and probably incapable of achieving this feat. Conversely, however, some other big sauropods, like the almost equally large diplodocids, had centers of gravity around the region of their hips, and which would allow them to live bipedally. Apatosaurus is an example of a diplodocid, which also appears in the franchise in the first Jurassic World movie.
Another probably inaccurate feature would also be the position of the neck of sauropods in the movies. Brachiosaurus was undeniably tall, but usually the rest position of the neck of large animals tends to be in a diagonal position rather than fully vertical. This makes sense, even comparing to many modern living long-necked animals like the giraffe. It allows for a proper balance between the head being so high and allowing the blood flow to defy the complications of gravity. This would also apply for a fully horizontal neck posture, so even Apatosaurus would probably have a diagonal position for its neck. Ultimately, and probably the most striking anatomical inaccuracy, are the feet. The feet of sauropods were far from elephantine-like. While the back limbs were decently column-like, the front limbs had more in common with stuff like horses, a bit thinner and, more importantly, unguligrade, with the tips of the fingers touching the ground. In the case of the Apatosaurus, for example, it would have shown a large thumb spike, perhaps used for combat, either against other members of its kind or against predators. The next dinosaur that we observe is the velociraptor, hatching from an egg. We technically see it in the opening sequence, but it's not clear, and we also see a fossil of it earlier. Velociraptor is interesting for how it's a relevant dinosaur across the entire franchise. That said, however, Velociraptor is not accurate in the movies. Yes, it was a bipedal carnivorous predator that lived in the Cretaceous period and had a powerful sickle claw in each foot, but much more of the movie interpretation doesn't match the real animal. Probably the most famous complaint is that Velociraptor was feathered.
It literally looked like a bird, but with a long tail, clawed fingers in its wings, and a beakless snout with menacing sharp teeth. Although we haven't found direct impressions of feathers in Velociraptor, beyond some quill knobs that relate to wing feather attachment, we know that relatives were extensively feathered. Although Velociraptor couldn't fly because it was too large, it could still use its wings to flap around and balance when bouncing prey. Despite being amazing weapons, the claws of Velociraptor have since been found to not have been used to slash prey, but rather to restrain them by latching onto them, with the toothed mouth doing the job of finishing it off.
Another famous inaccuracy is the fact Velociraptor was not as large as it's shown in the movies. It was actually just around 2 meters long. So it actually was a 6-foot turkey. As mentioned before, the raptors that we see in the movies are, however, more consistent with another genus of the same family as the Velociraptor, the Deinonychus. This raptor was large, at around 3.5 meters in length, and had a much stockier skull, similar to the raptors we see in the movies. Deinonychus was still very much a feathered animal, but it would be more consistent with its shape regardless. Deinonychus inspired the raptors of the franchise extensively, as fossils of these have been found together even in association with a contemporaneous herbivorous dinosaur, which led to the idea that Deinonychus not only was a swift animal given its physique, but it was also a social, perhaps pack-hunting animal, defying the notion that dinosaurs were slow, dumb reptiles.
However, later conclusions led to the idea that raptors possibly were not the super intelligent pack hunters that appear in the movies, and probably just randomly joined to catch the same prey whenever that occurred. They would cooperate to take down prey, but once it's down, the raptors would probably compete for the food, rather than share it in an hierarchy. This is more or less inferred from birds of prey and other reptiles, which are not exactly known to practice pack hunting with frequency, so whenever applied to dinosaurs it was probably not very complex.
Though we have evidence of other carnivorous dinosaurs perhaps engaging in family lifestyles, though raptors have some solid evidence on their side that they were probably more prone to live on their own most of the times. They were also not smarter than stuff like primates. Their encephalization quotient would probably not make raptors much more intelligent than a normal brain bird. To add it up, despite the name, Velociraptor was probably not the fastest of predatory dinosaurs on land. Their leg proportions are consistent with relatively fast sprints indeed, but they were not adapted for a cursorial way of life and might have ambushed their prey rather than chase it at high speeds, otherwise they would lose their energy quite fast. So yeah, they were actually dumb turkeys that couldn't even figure out how to open a door, probably.
I mean, let's not underestimate these guys too much. It doesn't really take much to learn how to open a door.
So yeah, the star of the franchise is sadly debunked. So what other dinosaurs can we ruin? If we go by order of appearance, we now have the mighty Triceratops.
So they kinda nailed the basic aspects, so perhaps I'll just lump many of the generic large herbivores like Stegosaurus and Ankylosaurus, the Hadrosaurs and other ceratopsids into this category. Beyond some body proportions being wrong, the animals are in their essence rather accurate. We know from skin impressions that all of these groups were probably scaly dinosaurs rather than feathered ones, though there are other points that they fail. Very poorly conceived, their feet are again rather simplistic and elephantine, when dinosaur feet add more nuanced differences. Ceratopsids add rather fingery back feet rather than column-like ones, and their front feet are very reminiscent of a recent transition to quadrupedality. As a matter of fact, ceratopsids are more recent than Hadrosaurs, Ankylosaurs and Stegosaurs, so their feet would be more reminiscent to that of a bipedal dinosaur than to the derived quadrupedal ones. The legs of the Hadrosaurs are rather accurate at their basic state, but there are still inaccuracies to point out. For instance, Hadrosaurs like Parasaurolophus are usually depicted in the movies as bipedal animals. Although the center of gravity of Hadrosaurs allowed them to adopt a bipedal stance, they were largely quadrupedal animals, evidenced by their front feet, which were almost horse-like. Unlike the movie depictions, the hand would even have a very defined hoof-like nail.
However, it is pretty feasible that Hadrosaurs would be running in two legs if needed. Now, with the tails of these animals.
Beyond the tails of these animals being slightly off in posture, in some of these they are just proportionately wrong. In Triceratops, for example, the tail is much longer than it actually was in real life, and Ankylosaurus much more of the tail is wrong.
Not only the club of the movie version is off, but also its flexibility. Ankylosaurus' tails were not as flexible as that of many other herbivorous dinosaurs, they were much more stiffened, so to allow for a much bigger stability when swinging the club against predators, and allow for a much more massive blow. Stegosaurus' proportions are also rather off. This dinosaur might have had a less arched position of its back, and its tail would be held horizontally. The real-life Stegosaurus would also probably have a longer neck as well. In the case of the Ankylosaurus, a lot is wrong in general. The way the armor is organized is off in many respects pretty much. Its legs are also shorter in real life.
Some of these quadrupedal animals are seen galloping in the movies, though studies don't seem to be very consistent with that. At best they would be fast trotting, or in the case of Ankylosaurus, possibly nothing, because they were so slow and heavy. The next dinosaur that is showed in the franchise is the Dilophosaurus, which is rather far from the real animal. The movie did take enormous liberties in interpreting it. For context, Dilophosaurus was actually not a small dog-sized dinosaur.
It was big. It reached 7 meters in length, and it was one of the largest land predators of its time. Note that Dilophosaurus lived much earlier than much larger theropods like Tyrannosaurus rex.
So it being a pug-sized dinosaur is contradictory with this fact, though we could assume this is a baby rather than an adult. However, where the movies take the most liberty is by giving the Dilophosaurus a frill, and the ability of spitting a blinding mucus venom. Given the evidence we have from fossils, there is absolutely no indication that frill or venom was part of this animal. However, we have to understand that we may never know 100% about every prehistoric animal, so a bit of speculation is doable.
Though, to be honest, an extendable frill like this one would probably not be present with the lack of stuff like advanced eoid bones, like the ones found in the Australian frilled lizard, which has a similar structure. And with no sutures in the teeth that indicate a venomous bite, it's unlikely that was a thing these dinosaurs were using to restrain prey. Usually venomous animals are slow and comparatively weak animals that utilize a lot of their energy to produce venom strong enough to paralyze their prey almost instantly. In a large, fast predator with sharp and menacing teeth, the inclusion of venom would be, at best, redundant to kill the prey, so it's most likely not a feature this dinosaur would have.
Then we go to the monstrosity, that is the dinosaur ever, the mighty Tyrannosaurus rex. In stark contrast to the velociraptor, the other star of the franchise is actually quite loyal to what the actual dinosaur was. Surely again there are a few proportion issues, but overall it's not too far off from the current interpretation. There was a point, somewhere around the early 2010s, where there was a growing assumption that Tyrannosaurus was actually a feathered dinosaur.
This conclusion was based on the discovery of some members of the Tyrannosaur group to have been found with feathers, the small Tyrannosaur D-long and the large Eutyrannus, both found to have lived at around the same time and place in China some 125 to 120 million years in the early Cretaceous. They were not from the same family as Tyrannosaurus, but they were indeed part of the same lineage. This was quite crushing, as this implied that Tyrannosaurs might not have been large, scaly dinosaurs, but rather having a skin covered in simple, hair-like feathers. This was until subsequent analysis that looked at skin impressions recovered from members of the specific Tyrannosaurid family found out that the closest relatives of Tyrannosaurus actually had a scaly skin throughout much of its body. So, rather ironically, the concept of a scaly tyrannosaur was seen as a probability, then seen as an unlikelihood, and then back to a strong likelihood. With this, we can assume that basal and more primitive tyrannosaurs had feathers, while the ones that are more closely related to Tyrannosaurus were actually scaly.
So overall, a scaly Tyrannosaurus makes sense, given the evidence we have. Another thing that causes a more recent debate is whether or not sauropods like Tyrannosaurus had lips. And with lips, I don't mean fleshy, muscular coverings like the ones we have with mammals, but simple, fleshy coverings along the mouth line that does not move and protects the teeth.
This is recently being regarded as a very likely condition for dinosaurs in general, save for the ones that have a beak, based on the structure of foramen around the mouth. This is in contrast to the derived condition of crocodilians, which have no fleshy lips and their teeth are exposed as a result. This does not rule out, however, that Tyrannosaurus could have had teeth exposed when the mouth is closed, but that it would most likely have fleshy lips covering, at the very least, the gums of the teeth. However, the skull and tooth orientation of Tyrannosaurus is consistent with the possibility of lips fully closing the mouth and encasing the teeth inside the mouth, so that is the most parsimonious conclusion to make.
Obviously though, exposed teeth are much more menacing traits, and maybe that's why it was placed in the Tyrannosaurus. In stark contrast with the raptors, the latter perhaps to give them a more intelligent or less reptilian look. Another issue with Tyrannosaurus is perhaps its assumed behavior of only reacting to prey when they move. This is actually something that some animals like frogs do, and they only react to their food whenever it moves. Which is funny given the animals in this movie have frog DNA.
However, the real-life Tyrannosaurus had a comparatively immensely accurate sight and sense of smell, so they should be able to know that a couple of kids are hiding motionless in a car. Then there is the roar.
Just no way a Tyrannosaurus could make this deafening sound, beyond being already very unnatural. Tyrannosaurus probably had very simple vocal apparatus based on the structure of their eoid bones. With this in mind, we can assume that Rex was probably making primitive sounds like the ones achieved by a crocodilian, which would still give rather menacing sounds anyway.
There's also the issue of Tyrannosaurus just shaking the entire ground when walking, which is notoriously unlikely.
T-Rex was as heavy as an elephant, and when elephants walk around they don't make that much noise and trembling in the ground. And if a T-Rex did indeed shake the ground when walking, then that's already a big warning for herbivores to sense its presence. The next animal to corrupt is the Gallimimus, those funky running guys we see in flocks. Although they were actually much larger than what the movie shows us, Like, seriously, Gallimimus was actually ginormous. It again doesn't respect too much of what we know about its appearance, like the fact it was probably feathered.
So yeah, this was pretty much a giant ostrich with a large tail. They nailed the fact that Gallimimus were probably rather fast animals though. As one moves beyond the animals that are shown in the first movie, The Lost World, or Jurassic Park 2, or Ian Malcolm fanfic, depends on what you want to name it, introduces new dinosaurs. One of them is the compsognathus. They are cute and small, but they wander around in flocks and eat children. Well, in reality they were rather different. Compsognathus was indeed rather small, and it was indeed a carnivorous dinosaur, so they nailed that. However, compsognathus, again, might have been feathered. Direct integument found from these animals, however, show bumps or tubercles in the region of the tail, somewhat resembling that of another sauropod that lived at around the same time and place, Juravenator. Juravenator had a scaly tail and feathers growing in between scales at the base of the tail. The phylogenetic understanding of where compsognathus lies is complicated to ascertain, especially as a very recent study recovers Juravenator as the young of a much larger sauropod, like a megalosaur, instead of a relative of compsognathus, and compsognathus itself is traditionally grouped alongside some heavily feathered small sauropods like Sinosauropteryx.
Overall, it seems rather likely that compsognathus was at least a half-feathered animal with a bumpy naked tail, and which makes for a rather interesting, more bird-like animal. We, however, do not know if compsognathus actually did live in groups or flocks, but I doubt such small dinosaurs would have the courage, will, or strength to take down a human, even as a group.
But Jurassic Park is not all about dinosaurs. They are also bringing pterosaurs to the mix. Pterosaurs are usually called dinosaurs, but the truth is they aren't. They are relatives of dinosaurs, however, and are almost as relevant in the Mesozoic ecosystems. Pterosaurs in the franchise are decent at times, though not the best. Pterosaurs in real life would have had a skin covered in hair-like filaments named pycnofibers. These might actually be related with feathers in dinosaurs, implying the common ancestor between pterosaurs and dinosaurs was actually feathered. In the movies, however, pterosaurs are largely shown to be naked flying reptilian beasts. But that's not all. Pteranodon, for example, is very inconsistent with the real animal, and we can't even blame the science not being as advanced back then.
Most of what we know about Pteranodon now, we already knew back then, so it's literally movie logic. Pteranodon name is a combination of the Greek words for wing and toothless, very coherent with the real animal, which was obviously a flyer and had a toothless beak. As a matter of fact, the fact that Pteranodon was toothless is really the reason why it's so famous, because it was so unique from other pterosaurs that we knew. However, at least in the critically acclaimed Jurassic Park 3, Pteranodon is seen with teeth, which is, yeah. Beyond that, Pteranodon in that movie doesn't seem to show much individual differences between each other, even though we know males were larger than females and had a bigger crest. And Pteranodon were avid, sea-dwelling animals and not monstrosities that lived on land that hunted humans. Well, obviously they didn't eat humans, there were no humans in the Cretaceous period, but you get my point. They wouldn't be eating humans if they were alive today. It would also be too lightweight to lift a human in the air, especially given they didn't even have prehensile feet to grab one. Jurassic World model kind of improves over the Jurassic Park 3 model by being smaller as well, and with the small crested individuals being the most common, as it would be expected. But that's really one of the few improvements. The other pterosaur that lives alongside Pteranodon in the Jurassic World aviary is the Dimorphodon.
Again, Dimorphodon was probably not looking forward to eat a human if it ever found one, and it was probably after small animals like small reptiles, synapsids, insects, amphibians, etc. It was also considerably much smaller than what the movie shows us.
Jurassic Park 3 shows another brand new creature beyond the Pteranodon, and this one is also a headacre. This is of course the mighty Spinosaurus. Back in 2001, we correctly guessed that Spinosaurus was among the largest sauropods the world has ever seen, perhaps indeed larger than Tyrannosaurus rex.
After 20 years, we correctly stand with the idea that this was a bipedal sailed dinosaur, longer than any other known sauropod with a vaguely croc-like snout. However, the proportions have since changed. This is not exactly the fault of the movie, but subsequent discoveries were made that gives us much different look for this dinosaur. For instance, its back legs were much shorter, so much that it's believed that this dinosaur would be rather weak at hunting prey on land, like it's so commonly seen in the movie, but instead it was probably spending most of its time in water. This is aided by the even more recent discovery of a large flattened tail to aid in aquatic propulsion. So we can surely observe an aquatic animal here, rather than an intensely terrestrial one. It would still be decently capable of walking on land, regardless, but it wouldn't be outrunning humans in the dense forest or taking down a T-Rex with its comparatively much weaker jaw strength.
That said, the movie does play a part in emphasizing its aquatic habits.
And finally, in Jurassic World, the franchise introduces us to another oceanic behemoth, the mosasaurus. Despite being depicted as a sea-level kaiju, mosasaurus is severely oversized in this.
It actually measured 12 to 13 meters in length and weighed at around 3 to 4 tons. It surely was big, but it wasn't bigger than even Spinosaurus. Mosasaurus, for a sea monster, was rather tame as well.
According to a recent study, it seems rather coherent that at least some mosasaurs were ill-prepared for a prolonged life in the open ocean, with them necessitating to live in shallow waters and drink fresh water out of river mouths and rainwater. This goes in accordance with the aquarium we see in the movie, which is shallow but still comfortably deep for the giant reptile. But I don't know how the staff of the park would content the reptile with a supply of fresh water. The integument of the mosasaurus is also wrong. They didn't have this whole bumpy and spiky skin like a crocodile. Instead, they had a nice, smooth, scaly skin, which grants them an hydrodynamic and smooth locomotion under the ocean waves. This ironically puts the gigantic monstrosity of the movie even more impractical than the real animal. At least they nailed its diet. As a large carnivorous reptile, feeding it with sharks makes perfect sense, and whenever the chance approached, I bet it wouldn't say no to a dinosaur.
So yeah, this is pretty much it. The franchise has missed a lot of points in regards to reconstructing the dinosaurs, but that's not all. Would taking care of dinosaurs like we see in the park work? For instance, the dinosaurs are placed in a tropical island with dense forests and grassy clearings.
Most of that flora and environment is somewhat alien to many dinosaurs. For instance, grass has only started to be a thing in the late Cretaceous period, and it wasn't such an abundant type of plant. Only later, in the age of mammals, grass started to become a valuable component of the world's grasslands and steppes, with animals adapting to a diet of such. Many dinosaurs were not so adapted for this. Hadrosaurs, sauropods, and ornithomimids might have the best chances, with hadrosaurs having superbly advanced dentition and a generalized diet that gives them an advantage in adapting to modern flora, and sauropods having very simple dentition that requires very little oral processing of the food, allowing them to eat pretty much anything as well, and ornithomimids having a toothless beak that also allows them to be versatile in which plants they eat. Stegosaurs, ankylosaurs, and ceratopsids had dentitions more specialized for specific plants, with stegosaurs probably being in the worst spot, with their jaws and teeth being weak for the consumption of hard and or fibrous material, so no woody or grassy foods for them, just ferns and fruit at best. Ankylosaurus was seemingly a browser of soft ferns and fruit, so they wouldn't be very perfected for the consumption of fibrous material. Ceratopsids, interestingly, were more adapted for fibrous material like herbs, shrubs, and small trees, but were probably ill-prepared for grasses. If the park staff are aware of this differentiation in needs, they should be prepared to counter this issue, but the movie seemed to casually put all the dinosaurs in uniform environments, sometimes living between each other, despite dietary incompatibilities. But I mean, we can appreciate the movie's logic without being mad at the disregard on scientific facts, right? I mean, it It's called the Jurassic Park franchise, and most of the dinosaurs here are from the Cretaceous, so it's already a misdirect. And even though the first 1993 Jurassic Park movie did a pretty good job at showing how dinosaurs actually look like in real life, based on what we knew about them back then, the core of the franchise isn't entirely that.
Really exploring how much do we humans are willing to change the natural law just for our own amusement. In a sense, how much are we willing to accept inaccurate cinematic monstrosities as a real thing? And how does that affect our understanding of the real world and the relationships we have with it? I guess in the end, Jurassic Park movies are just movies. Love them, hate them, they try their own thing. Dinosaurs in real life were their own amazing creatures, and without trying to shame the movies, it's still important to make the distinction between reality and fiction, so we can ultimately appreciate both.
So let's hope that, after humanity goes inevitably extinct, our species can continue and be revived with inaccurate reconstructions in a successful cinematic franchise made by a future society of sapient squirrels. So, until then, keep it up, and we will see you next. Hey, before you go, I have to thank today's sponsor, Rexcape. Everyone is using Rexcape these days, including Joe. Did you know that 1 out of 5 dinosaur lineages suffer partial or completely scaly integument? It sucks. You start developing these weird osteoderms and midline feature scales, and you start becoming a flappy, arm-farting, skinny little Stop being a skinny turkey and start vigorously showing off your feathers. Instead of whining raucously into your own integumentary predicaments, start developing filaments and keep yourself warm, light, and fluffier. You can now hug yourself and be hugged. The sky is the limit with Rexcape. Warning, don't use this on cats or dogs, it may have some unprecedented results. But more important than that, don't give this to fish. Last time that happened, it was 375 million years ago, and now we have to work on Mondays, cry on Wednesdays, and pray on Sundays. Get Rexcape now with a discount of 69% off by writing the code YP2001 plus 80085 plus your mom plus ratio in the link of the description below. Now, may I just say, thanks a lot for the amount of views and subscriptions I have been gaining. Apparently people are very fond of the science-oriented videos in this channel, even though I do some other stuff as well here. I have been bombed with an increase in popularity, and that's great. Really digging the constructive criticism, I am definitely considering it for future videos. Oh, and also, the totally relevant creationism comments really made me remind me of how much of a sheep I am for believing on the government conspiracy surrounding how dinosaurs are a made-up concept to make us follow our immortal demonic overlords. Anyway, I haven't been very active in updating this channel, real life is a thing and a bummer, so that's what it is. With that said, new things are coming for this channel. Eventually. Probably. Maybe. We'll see. So, stay tuned, hopefully. Keep it up.